Aloha, I'm State Representative Cindy Evans, and I represent on the Big Island, North Kona, South Kohala. Thanks for being with me today. And today we're going to talk about Hawaii invasive species, and I have Josh Atwood, who's the coordinator of the Hawaii Invasive Species Council. Hi.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. You know, at the legislature, we're always talking about invasive species, and as you just mentioned before we started this show, there's this bill on brown tree snake, which is just one of many bills and many initiatives that we're hearing about this session. And I think with this time that we have, this session, I think we'll talk about different initiatives, different bills. But before we get started, I think the audience would love to know more about the Invasive Species Council and about you.
Sure.
All right.
So the Invasive Species Council was created by statute in 2003. It originally came through as Senate Bill 1505, which includes some of my favorite language from a preamble ever, which is that the legislature finds that the silent invasion of Hawaii by invasive species is the single greatest threat to Hawaii's economy and lifestyle and the well-being of its citizens. So from that Senate bill came Chapter 194 of the Hawaii Revised Statutes, which establishes the council and dictates who is part of it. So the council is designed to be an interagency group that's composed of 6 state departments that are voting members, including the Department of Land and Natural Resources, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Health, Department of Transportation, Department of Business, Economic Development and Tourism, and the University of Hawaii. In addition to those 6 voting members, there are a number of state departments that participate in discussions so that they can have a voice as well. So we have the Department of Commerce and Consumer Affairs, Department of Defense, and the Department of Hawaiian Homelands, as well as 8 state legislators. There's a senator and a representative from each county that participates in our meetings or is invited to come to all of our discussions. So it's a great group for bringing together different state departments to discuss an issue that is so pervasive that it doesn't affect just one area of life. It's not, invasive species couldn't be addressed just by DLNR or just by DOA. It's such a broad impacting issue that all those departments have to come together to discuss it. So it's a great idea, and it's been functioning now for 8 years. We have some really good participation.
How did you get involved personally? I mean, it's always nice to know the person your passion. Tell us a little about you.
Sure. So my background is that I'm from Maine originally, but I love Hawaii since the first time I came here in 2004. I was working with a national organization that did community service programs. So I led this Hawaii-themed community service program where students in high school from around the country would come to Hawaii and participate in fieldwork, including invasive species control. So that was my first brush with the conservation community in Hawaii. I came back with the same company to lead another trip in 2006, and then I went into graduate school to get a doctorate in biology and environmental science. Part of my graduate experience included a funded externship to do work outside of my graduate school, which was in Rhode Island. And so I used that opportunity to work with the Bishop Museum here in Honolulu and the Oahu Invasive Species Committee. The Oahu Invasive Species Committee, or OISC, partners with the Bishop Museum on a project called Oahu Early Detection, and they are a group that assesses incipient plant species, ones that aren't well established yet but have the potential to become invasive. And so what they were working on was a multi-year roadside survey to identify and then plot geographically where these potentially harmful plant species were. So I came out and worked with that group for 4 months and sort of learned about what issues they were dealing with and did some outreach work for them in the conservation community. And that was the first time that I heard of the Hawaii Invasive Species Council. So after that internship was over, I went back to the East Coast, but it was really just a matter of time until I finished because I knew that I wanted to come right back here and work. So luckily for me, when I finished my degree, this position coordinating the council was open, and I came right back to work here.
Well, it sounds like you have a wonderful background for it, but I think more important is the stories about there's a lot of jobs and potential opportunities in conservation, natural resource management. What is your take on, I mean, a lot of people are watching the show and they maybe have nieces, nephews, children. I mean, there must be opportunity coming. Do you see this field, a growing field, an area that we should encourage our children to consider?
Most definitely. It's a field that I think when times are tough economically, the opportunities shrink as they would in any field. But because Hawaii is uniquely sensitive to environmental concerns like invasive species, there will always be jobs here that are focused on protecting Hawaii's environment. And so I think that it's a field that as we're faced with more issues and as the economy recovers, it's definitely an area where I would hope to see more job growth and more people getting involved. So for people who are wondering, what fields their children should go into, yeah, I would say environmental concerns is a great place to put your energy. We definitely need the help.
And this Invasive Species Council is administratively attached to our State Department of Land and Natural Resources.
That's right. So even though it's an interagency group, it has to be housed within one department or another for administrative purposes. So I sit within the Division of Forestry and Wildlife at the Department of Land and Natural Resources.
Have you found that you're getting a lot of, what would we call it, momentum this session on issues surrounding invasive species? Are you a little concerned that there's a few out there that are really gaining ground and, if we don't intervene now, that by the time we intervene it is too late?
Yes, there are definitely some species that I think are out there gaining ground, and they're at that critical point that coqui frog on the Big Island might have been at, say, 10 years ago, where you have this opportunity with a small isolated population or set of populations that you could deal with. But if you lose that opportunity to act, then the species becomes more established and control and eradication become more costly and less likely to succeed. So there are a few that are at that point now, including axis deer on the Big Island. That's a recent discovery that axis deer have been moved from Maui and Molokai over to the Big Island, and there are populations there that we're hoping can be controlled before it becomes established there. So I think that has spawned some action this legislative session, including a bill from Senator Kahele that would put additional restrictions on. Oh yes, so this here is a photo of an axis deer on the Big Island. This is some of the first evidence actually that we have that shows concretely that there are deer there. This is taken with a motion camera, and so the deer are very skittish as a species, and so they're hard to track down and document. So having motion cameras set up without people there accompanying them is a great way to document their presence. So this is one of the first photos of axis deer that we have, and from here we're hoping that we can start to monitor where the populations are and then put together a successful management plan.
And why? Why? I mean, obviously axis deer is hunters. It could be a game sport, but what did they do to the environment that we have to be worried about?
So axis deer are actually classified as a game mammal on certain other islands like Maui and Molokai. People hunt them and use them for meat. And the Department of Land and Natural Resources works with hunters to try to control those populations at a manageable size. But on the Big Island, where that species was not present before, there are a host of environmental issues that would be new to that area. Deer are ungulates or hooved animals, and so like feral goats or feral pigs, the problem that they pose for the environment is that their hooves tend to disturb the upper layer of soil. So they browse plants back, and then native plants have trouble regenerating because the soil is disturbed. So I think actually I brought an image today that shows the difference between a fenced area and a non-fenced area and the damage that ungulates can do. Basically, when you have an area that's free of ungulates, you have a healthy native forest that's regenerating. And if there are ungulates in that area, then the plants aren't able to grow back after disturbance. And if anything, disturbance tends to favor fast-growing invasive weeds, and so they can actually promote the growth of non-desirable plants.
So ungulates are hoofed animals, and we have the pigs. We even have don't we have cattle that are wild that might be out there?
Yeah, I think that's in terms of numbers less of an issue, but yeah, cattle are definitely a species that can cause issues if they're outside of agricultural areas.
And then we have the goats, which is a big issue. At least on the Big Island where I'm at, we have a lot of goats as well as turkeys everywhere.
And mouflon sheep as well. That's another species that is present in large numbers in disturbed soil because of its hooves.
So does your council work with hunters? Do you work with ranchers? Obviously from what you've said with the Department of Defense, that's a huge landowner or someone who controls a large piece of land. So they need to be at the table because they're land managers. So I can see why they would be there.
Right.
But what about the bigger ranching and cattle and the landowners around the state? Where do they play in this discussion?
They would certainly be welcome to participate in our discussions. I think historically we have not had a lot of interaction with the hunting community, perhaps because our meetings have been focused in Honolulu where the council members are working. It's difficult for us to interact on a face-to-face basis with the hunting community across the state. So one of the things that we're hoping to do in the near future is have a council meeting that's outside of Honolulu. Hopefully later this year we're going to have a meeting on Maui, specifically to work with the Maui County Council and to engage with the Maui community to talk about axis deer on Maui. It's an issue of not eradication necessarily because there are so many deer on Maui, but instead trying to find a long-term management plan that would keep them at a population size that allows us to minimize negative impacts such as deer crossing roads and causing accidents or causing large-scale agricultural damage.
Well, that leads me to ask, as a policymaker, we're talking about the council being attached to the Department of Land and Natural Resources, the Division of Forest and Wildlife. And yet, at each county level, they have their own specific issues. But when it comes to really tackling the problems, doesn't need to be done at the community level. If it has to be done at the community level, where does the state really, what responsibility do they have, or should we be engaging more with county government, the council, and saying, we know you got a problem, but it's close to home, and come on, county, we need to, have you step up to some leadership position. But what's the relation between the county and the state? Because if you just say the county would say, well, it's a problem, but we're going to wait for the state to solve it. Well, we have very limited resources. That's a very difficult thing. So tell me a little bit about these dynamics between, the state and the county, and how do we do it at the local level?
Right. Yeah, the relationship between the counties and the state obviously has to be a positive one for invasive species efforts to succeed. And I think Maui County provides a really excellent example of that. The initiative to put together a long-term management plan for axis deer on Maui was initiated not by the Invasive Species Council at the state level, but by the Maui County Council. And then they submitted a request to the statewide Invasive Species Council to provide some assistance in developing that plan. So that's a process that we're working on now. And we have representation from the Maui County Council at Invasive Species Council meetings. And also within the Invasive Species Council has 4 working groups that are comprised of members of the public and conservation organizations, and the Maui County Council has been interacting with those working groups as well. So we would like to see a better relationship with the counties outside of Maui, but I think that provides a really good example of what that relationship could look like.
Well, let's move on to a couple invasive species.
Sure.
All right, so what one do you want to tackle first? Do you want to tackle plants or animals?
Let's talk about animals. So I brought some examples of species that were particular problems on the Big Island. The Big Island is faced with some of the worst problems for invasive species. They are by far the island that has the most widespread little fire ant, which I brought a photo of today. The little fire ant is a species of ant that's incredibly tiny. The ants are about 1/16 of an inch long. And the problem with little fire ants is that they have really large colony sizes, and they have the ability to become the dominant species in almost any kind of habitat. So whether it's an urban environment, an agricultural land, or a natural area, these ants can dominate the landscape. They have severe negative impacts on humans in that they have this very powerful sting that's coordinated amongst the ants. So the ants will not sting you at first. They'll sort of cluster onto the skin, and then through the release of a pheromone chemical, coordinate a timed release of their sting, which can be really powerful. So it's definitely a species that you don't want in your home, and something that you don't want in your yard if you have animals in the yard or kids playing outside. So there's some real negative impacts there. Also for wildlife that can be stung by these ants, that's a negative impact on them as well. So it's a species that is very hard to eradicate once it's established. So on the Big Island, again, along the Hamakua coast at least, it's at a stage where they're not talking necessarily about eradication, but rather management and trying to keep it from spreading. It's also been detected on the Kona side of the Big Island. There was a population on Maui that was pretty persistent, but the Hawaii Department of Agriculture sponsors a Hawaii Ant Lab program that is specialized to deal with these sorts of cases. And then we also have the Hawaii Invasive Species Committee. So those groups, along with some others, have been tackling the problem on Maui. And I believe that they have eradicated the local infestation of little fire ants there because they caught it early, knew what to look for, and were prepared to respond to it. On Kauai, there's one location that has had a persistent infestation of little fire ant for about 10 years now, and the issue there is access for control and also having the funding and permitting in place to respond to the infestation. So far, groups on Kauai have been successful in keeping it from spreading to other areas, but the population still exists there. And so it's something that we have to monitor and hope that it doesn't spread before we have the opportunity to really respond to it and hopefully eradicate it on that island.
Now the permitting part, let's talk about that. That's the ability to go on private land with or without the owner's permission?
Well, that's part of it. I mean, I think that these groups that do control work always want to work with landowners and obtain permission before going onto property. So there's permits for access, but then also permits for pesticide use. So there are a lot of products that are developed very creatively by the conservation community to address these concerns, but they have to be permitted for use before we can put them out into the environment. So that's another area where that's something that can hold up projects in responding to new threats of invasive species.
So how does the homeowner know if they have them? Is this where you put peanut butter on a stick?
Yeah, that's right.
I think I remember this, but how does anybody that's watching today, if they want to know?
Sure. There was actually a program on Maui for a while where school kids were taking home jars, and then they would have chopsticks with peanut butter on them. You put it out in the yard for half an hour or so, and then you take the sample, put it in a bag, and then you would take it back to school and give it to a scientist who would ID whatever ant species had come to your chopsticks. And so that was a great way that they involved kids in education and community monitoring for that species. But that method is also used by the Department of Agriculture or the Hawaii Ant Lab for detecting ant species in cargo containers or shipments of plants that might go inter-island. So yeah, peanut butter is a great attractant.
Well, one of the reasons I love this show is because I learned so much. And when you said Hawaii Ant Lab, I have never heard of the Hawaii Ant Lab. What is this?
So they're actually a really interesting group. They are based out of Hilo, and they're funded partially through the Department of Agriculture, partially through the Hawaii Invasive Species Council. We have an annual budget that we use to fund projects such as the Hawaii Ant Lab, and they have some other funding sources as well. But basically, it's an expert entomologist and some support staff that do research on ants, do research on eradication methods, and they also try to develop response tools that can be used to manage infestations. So they've invented some really creative ways of deploying pesticides and attractants that try to control infestations. So they have something called the spackler of death, which is basically a paint spackler that's used to project an attractant bait and also a pesticide into tree areas that you wouldn't be able to reach otherwise. One of the problems with little fire ant is that it's an arboreal ant species, so it can exist not only on the ground, but it can make nests and colonies that are living up in the tops of trees. So it can be really difficult to control if you don't have a way to get pesticides up into tree branches where they might be living.
Ooh, and when you're a little kid and want to, crawl up the trees, I used to do that. Ooh, you might get into some ants.
Exactly, yeah.
Ooh.
So I know there are some people that I've talked to on the Big Island who, they have young children that they don't put on the ground and have trouble finding opportunities to learn to crawl and walk because the ground has these stinging ants. Parents don't want their children moving around in areas that are infested with ants.
So if anybody's watching and if you have them, who should they call?
They can call the Hawaii Ant Lab in Hilo. They can also call, we have a statewide pest hotline, it's 643-PEST. And it connects to a phone tree, so depending on what island you're on when you call, it connects to a different set of experts that can best address your concern.
All right, that's important, 643-PEST.
Yes, yep.
Wow, I bet you get some interesting calls. Have you been getting any calls about snakes? I was a little worried recently because they said in January that there was some snakes here in Oahu.
Right.
So do people call this number?
Yep, yeah, this hotline is also used for snake reports. And I don't get the calls personally, but I talk to the people who do, and yeah, they get snake reports every now and then. And so sometimes it's snake calls from harbor areas where cargo containers are brought in, and snakes might be accidental stowaways with goods that are traded commercially. And then other times, snakes can be released from homes where they're kept as pets illegally. It's not legal to keep a snake as a pet in Hawaii, but sometimes people do anyway. So there's a $200,000 fine associated with that. And sometimes, rather than being caught with that illegal animal, people will release it into the wild. And so sometimes snake calls are from that.
So these amnesty programs that we have are wonderful, and I hope we continue to have them because we don't want to discourage people. I mean, a pet, when you have a pet and you get attached to your pet, I can understand people loving their pet and you don't want to leave it behind. But the reality is our environment will not tolerate a new species like that because our environment, the animals in our environment do not know how to deal with it. So when a snake comes up, it's like, hello, instead of running away, so it's very dangerous. And I've been following what's happening in the Everglades in Florida, and I'm astonished how the Burmese python, the pythons, and they're just going across the whole southeast of the United States. They are prolific, and they're killing off, like the albatross is almost totally wiped out in the Everglades, and there's other species that they were always in the Everglades, and they're almost like 1% of the population is left because the pythons have them for lunch and dinner and snacks
And the ecological impacts would be similar here. There's no natural predator for snakes in Hawaii. So if snakes were able to establish here, they would be able to reproduce without that natural balance on their population size. So they would do really well. And then the impacts to, say, our native bird populations would be devastating because you have this large snake population. It needs a food source. It's going to look to things like native birds to provide food. So this issue happened in Guam after the Second World War. Brown tree snakes were introduced to Guam through some military cargo, most likely. And there were, I believe, 14 species of endemic bird species that were native to Guam. And now there's something like 2 that are left in the wild because the brown tree snake has reproduced unchecked It's all through the forest, and so it can eat bird eggs whether they're on the ground or up in trees, and so the native bird population has been devastated. So if you go into the Guam forest at night, rather than hearing bird calls, you hear silence. After it had decimated the bird population, the snakes moved on to amphibians, and it has reduced the amphibian population there, which in turn has increased the insect population because you don't have the amphibians to control them. So the forest in Guam has a lot of bugs and no birds and few amphibians. So it's really interesting to walk through and to think how different it must have been just 60 years ago, and to think that that's what could happen to Hawaii if we had an introduction of brown tree snakes here.
So with the time we have left, see, I told you it was going to go fast.
Sure.
With the time we have left, I think it's imperative that we talk about what can we do to make sure there's enough funding, there's enough partnerships, there's enough collaboration, there's enough of us working on this, because I don't really want to see what happened to Guam happen to Hawaii. So, talk to us. You got a minute and
Sure.
a little over a minute saying why we need to do this.
So conservation funding in Hawaii has always been difficult to come by, even in the good economic times. And the reality is that people come to Hawaii because it's naturally beautiful. That's one of the great assets of this state. But we're not investing in protecting that environment. So currently there are some bills in the legislative session this year that would provide funding for watershed protection, including mitigating invasive species in watershed areas. Those funds would go into the Natural Area Reserve Fund, which is administered by the Department of Land and Natural Resources for protecting priority watershed areas and other high conservation value habitats in Hawaii. So anything that people see in the ledge session that can provide funds for conservation always helps. And contacting legislators to make sure that your legislative senators and representatives know that the environment is an important issue to you, that's something that people can do to really make a difference.
Really, and I think that, clearly government plays a role in many areas, but I would say, besides public education, besides our prisons, other things that we take for granted with government, clearly this issue of tackling invasive species I see as a government function, very well coordinated, and I hope the public, it's really a challenge for us, and I hope the public works with us to try to figure out how to fund, how to make sure that we tackle these problems so that we keep the environment, the way we love it currently today, and for future generations. We really have to tackle it, or we're going to end up with, not being able to go out on the beach because we got fire ants, and so it's a big deal.
Yep.
But thank you for coming today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was great.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Thanks for joining us, and take care, and aloha.